Good morning. I told Crystal this morning, hopefully I can see and read my writing and my voice holds out. We had a wonderful time at the Brandon Lake concert. Praise and worship time, more like it. And I knew about halfway through, I need to quit being so loud with my voice or I'm not going to be able to talk tomorrow. But it was wonderful. And then with that and the time change, I'm not quite sure my eyeballs are all the way open, but we're going to do our best. In my teaching that I've been doing the women in the lineage of Christ. And the last time that I taught, we talked about Rahab. About after the fall of Jericho, Rahab and her family had been rescued as was promised to her. And they were placed, we talked about how they were placed outside the camp. So they were no longer a part of Jericho, and all that got destroyed, but they weren't quite ready to fully join the Israelites. So they had to go through a time of purification and transition and eventual integration among them. The scripture said that she lives among the Israelites to this day. Now, we do know, because of having the benefit of the full Bible, we know that she married an Israelite, a descendant of Judah. That's why she appears in the lineage. And according to the lineage in Matthew 1, and this is the first 6 verses of it, but you see the bold is Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. And then Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, who we're going to talk about today. But before that, I want to talk just a little bit of context, just so that when we go into this, we kind of have, kind of know where we're at. There's something you need to know about genealogies, especially genealogies of this time and this culture. It was not uncommon for them to just skip generations, to leave out information, kind of hit the high point, so to speak. So biblical genealogies often skip generations. The next couple slides, you can see there are 3 sets. This set, and then there's one more set. That's the genealogy from Abraham to Jesus that appears in Matthew. It is significant because the women that appear in it, that also was not a common thing that we would see, especially in that day, were to see women have any kind of standing, any kind of mention in genealogies. So it's really significant that we see them in there. And we see Rahab's name in there that we just talked about. This is the Rahab from Jericho. Matthew does structure the genealogy into 3 groups of 14. How convenient. I think that was a comedian's kind of tagline there. Do you think that the genealogy was that neat, that it was exactly 14, 14, 14? No. There's been some things that have been edited out. I came across this term that I had never heard before, the gematria. Is that the next one? And it's a Jewish practice of numerology where it says the practice of assigning a numerical value to a name, word, or phrase and reading it as a number, sometimes by using an alphanumeric cipher. So, of course, we can't read this unless you could read Hebrew. Maybe Jim and anybody that might have taken that class. But numbers assigned to it. But the number for David in Hebrew is 14. So some scholars say that that's something that Matthew did intentionally to further drive home the link between David in the line of Judah, David to Jesus. So that's just a little nugget for you. So it was funny when after I'd finished Rahab and I was starting to read a little bit of Ruth, and I laid down, I laid my head on the pillow, and I heard, is Rahab really his grandmother? I was like, oh, I don't know. Never really thought about it. So that's when I started going down all the rabbit holes and reading all the things about the genealogies. If we go back and look at the first genealogy, verses 1 through 6, from Perez down to Aminadab, that covers 400 years. There's got to be some stuff missing there, right? In that third set, there are kings that are left out. Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah don't appear in that list. So there's evidence right there that we know that there have been generations left out. Another thing to keep in mind too is with Hebrew and the Jewish culture is that familiar terms were somewhat flexible in that within the culture and custom to call someone a son who is the father of a descendant. So, just like they called Jesus son of David. Well, I mean, he wasn't, the next line down. I mean, it was generations. So the grandfather might call the grandson son, and the great-grandfather might call the great-great-grandson son. So it was a more general kind of term. And then I started looking at the timelines, and I did find a really good article on this, and there was no way I could present it or get it down, but I wanted to show you this timeline I created after reading it. So we had the Exodus, when they left Egypt around 1446 BC, and then the fall of Jericho, which is where we found the account of Rahab. So that was about after wandering 40 years in the desert, so that puts it at about 1406 or so for the fall of Jericho. So there was 40 years in between that. And then the judges began to rule in around 1375 after Joshua had passed away. And I started thinking about all that time that Rahab, she had integrated into the Israelites. She had married, obviously had children. But I thought about all the things that she got to see, after this miraculous thing she did where, she, helped the spies and God spared her and her family. She saw the destruction of Jericho. She saw them marching around, all those days, and then the 7 times on the final day, and that the sound of the trumpets brought. She saw that amazing thing. She had heard about the amazing things God had done, parting the Red Sea, being with him in battles against the enemies. And that is what gave her that faith that she had. And then she got to see that with her own eyes. But then she got to see, as they conquered in the Promised Land, she saw the battles that they won and some of the battles that they lost. And the consequence, she saw the consequences of Achan's sin. She was there when the sun stood still. She would have seen that. When the covenant was renewed at Shechem, when they divided the land among the tribes, she would have witnessed all of those things. And just think, coming from her background, just how she would have had, just been so amazed by all that. But we had the time of the judges that started, and most scholars put the story of Ruth and Boaz around 1100 BC. That's 275 years. So could Rahab be the father of Boaz? 275 years. So it is probably very likely that they've left out a few of those generations. And then I started thinking, well, nothing is impossible. So I thought, if we assume Rahab, maybe she was as young as 14 when that happened, when Jericho happened, and she waited 50 years to have Boaz. That would have been 1356. And assuming Boaz was 80 in 1110, and that could have made him born in 1190, it still would have been about 166 years. I mean, I could never come up with a scenario where she was young enough and he was old enough, because we know when we read Ruth, we know he was a bit of an older man, older than Ruth. But could it have been possible? And people will point to the story of Sarah and Abraham, right? Well, so she was in her advanced age when she had Isaac. But that was very unique circumstances. Even Sarah herself laughed at the idea that at her age she could have a baby. So that would have been it was not a common thing then for a woman of her age to have a baby. And then Abraham would be capable of being the father. So even if Rahab was 90 when she had Boaz and he was 100 in 1100, there still would have been 131 years in between. So it's just hard to account for. You know, if everybody was having babies in their old age like that, then the story of Sarah really wouldn't be that significant, would it? So likely there are genealogies there. Now, they could have also been left out on the other end, but it's more likely that it's in there where these generations are left out of the genealogy. David came in to be king in 1010, and that's kind of how they also kind of gauge where this fell. So in my calculations, I came up with between 1090 and 1105, which is their 1100, give or take 5 or 10 years. So Rahab is a grandmother to David. We just don't know how many greats are in front of that. But she is definitely in that lineage. She and the other women are significant, like I said, because women were not typically found in these genealogies, and these were non-Jewish women on top of that. So it was very significant. Despite their flaws, despite them not being Jewish, any of those things, none of that was held against them. They were included because they had great faith in God, and they had totally committed themselves. So does any of this really matter? Does it really matter? Why do we need to know stuff like this? Why was it important for you to kind of know this? Because there are other people that are looking for this, but they're not looking for it the same reasons that you are. They're looking for holes that they can punch into the gospel. They'll point this out as proof. They'll see, this is not real. This is all made up. No way she could have been his actual birth mother. So if this isn't true, then none of the rest of it's true, right? Kathy taught last week about being a capable Christian, right? And it's about knowing, not just knowing it, but knowing the context of it, knowing the whys of it, being able to explain it. 2 Timothy. You can recite this almost so fast you're like that FedEx guy in that commercial, Be diligent to present yourself approved to God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And in the NIV it says, correctly handles the word of truth. To rightly divide means to handle, to interpret, and to teach the Bible accurately and skillfully, like a craftsman, cutting in a straight line. It involves studying Scripture in its proper context to avoid distortion and ensuring sound doctrine, and applying God's message correctly. So we have to become craftsmen with the Word. And if you start thinking about yourself in that way, you'll probably start reading and studying in a different light. That you've got to read it, you've got to understand the context, you've got to dig in and get the meaning, and it's gonna, every time you read it, you're gonna get something new out of it because it's a living word. So that when you share it, you can answer the whys and the questions and, well, how is that possible? Because we know that this word is true. To the casual reader, most people that sit down and just read the book of Ruth or read Matthew and read those genealogies, they probably just kind of skim over those genealogies, don't even read those names in there, because especially out loud, because trying to figure out how to say them sometimes is the biggest challenge. But so they may not think about the actual dates. It doesn't really, they just see it. The skeptic, however, is going to be in there crunching numbers and looking for holes and trying to exploit those. But the scholar, the one who's rightly dividing the word, is going to look at it and study it for context, learning about the knowledge of Hebrew customs and traditions and how that applies, and then figuring out how now that applies to our lives today. So that's the challenge we have as Bible studiers, is that we've got to do that. We've got to have that love for the word, that we want to have that context. So there's the context that I want you to have going into this. And we are going to talk about Ruth. We're going to be doing the first chapter today, and then the next time I'll be doing the other chapters. But let's go ahead and start with Ruth 1, verses 1 through 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the name of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. So there's a famine in the land, and they make that hard decision that they're going to leave and they're going to go to the land of Moab because they don't want to die in this famine. And after they're there, the patriarch of the family dies, Elimelech. And then later on, also his sons. They left because they didn't want to die in Bethlehem of famine, but they went to Moab. And guess what? They still died. They still died. Yep. But the boys, they had grown. They married Moabite women because guess who was around? Moabite women. But after 10 years, it said that they died, and they surprisingly did not have any children. So now we have three widows who have been left. They have no husbands now, no father, no sons to care for them. That makes them easy targets in society. It actually was a kind of a dangerous situation for them. But here's Naomi. Now she has these two daughter-in-laws, Orpah, whose name means neck or fawn, and Ruth, whose name means friend or companion. Verses 6 through 10. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. With her two daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." So Naomi gets word. They didn't have social media back then, but word still got around, right? People always have a way of getting news out there. So she hears that things have turned around in Bethlehem. That the Lord has blessed the land again. There's crops, there's food. It was no longer scarce there. So Naomi she's looking at two choices of what to do with her life. Now that she's a widow, her sons are gone. She could stay in Moab. She could stay there, but her only family really would be these two daughters-in-law. Well, what happens if they marry? They're going to have a new family. Do you think they're going to have much to do with her? They're going to get new mothers-in-law, right? What did she really have there? Naomi herself, she could marry again, but the likelihood that she would marry a Moabite man, based on what we know from reading this book, that's not the kind of woman that Naomi was. Naomi was a woman who loved God. So her other choice then was that she could return back home to Judah to her families and friends, and the blessings now that are with them. Hearing of the goodness of God and how he had restored things, that's what drew her back. If her husband had not died, if he'd still been alive, she probably thought to herself, what would he have done? He probably would have wanted to take his family back. We don't know. We don't really know what was in her head, but I try to think about, how I would feel, what I would think about that. So she wanted to return. And her two daughter-in-laws, how sweet, how faithful they were to her, how they loved her. Man, that's not always the case, is it, in those in-law situations? If if you have a mother-in-law that loves you, you are blessed indeed. You know, because sometimes those relationships are a little strained. And here, both of these girls just loved her, even though they had, this was their home, this was their family. They were willing to just say, no, we can leave all that behind and we're going with you. Naomi must have been a wonderful mother-in-law, like a true mother to them, that they would want to do that. But then Naomi, and she's like, starts out, and then Naomi does a really kind thing. She says, I can't let you do that. I can't let you do this. This is your home. This is where your family is at. For you to come with me, I'm an old woman, I've lost my husband. You're going back. For you to go with me, I can't guarantee you what your life is going to be like there. I don't know that you'll find husbands there. You just stay. She did a very kind thing in releasing them from what they felt was like a responsibility. Sometimes people need to be released. People, that are so faithful, and they will do things sometimes, even if it's just obligation, because that is important to them. That's their character. But when they really don't have to do it, but because that's who they are. But sometimes you have to release people so that they can go on and do the things that God wants them to do. So I thought she was very kind in doing that to them. Naomi also knows, about the Jewish traditions of the kinsman redeemer, which we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So she blesses them. She gives them praises for their kindness. She prays for them, prays that they're going to find husbands, that they'll find rest and peace, by starting a new family. It was a prayer of provision. She was not going to be able to provide for them. She was a widow. She probably didn't have a whole lot of resources left. So she's praying this provision over them. They had been with her for so many years. Surely they had seen her life. That's probably what drew them so close to her, was such a godly woman she was. Even though she was in Moab, she was still that daughter of God. She still operated as a godly woman. And I think that that's what really drew them to her and made them love her so much. She was someone who prayed and who encouraged and who really lived her faith. Verses 11 through 14. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. So again, this is touching on that Jewish law custom of the Levirate marriage. We talked about this when I taught about Judah and Tamar. Remember how Tamar had been married to Judah's son, and he died. So then she was married to the brother, and he wouldn't give her a child. He made it so that she couldn't get pregnant, and God killed him. And then there was one more son, and she was going to have to wait for him to grow up a little bit. And Judah kept putting her off, and that's why she took things in her own hands and did what she did to have the child with Judah. So that tradition, if a woman's husband dies with no son, her husband's brother was responsible for providing an heir. Well, there were no brothers. Both brothers had died. And Naomi's like, even if I had a son, got pregnant and had a son today, are you going to wait for them to grow up? Are you going to remain unmarried until, they would do that? Well, no, of course not. And these two girls now had two very different responses to that. Orpah saw the wisdom in what Naomi was saying, and she accepted that release that Naomi gave her. And she kissed her goodbye, and she went back to her people and back to her gods. But Ruth, she was completely different. She clung to Naomi, it said. I think about like a child, how a child will come up and, get you around the leg. I had one of those leg kids that went with me everywhere. She was always on my leg. Now I can't get her to give me the time of day. But she clung to her. They faced similar prospects. She's saying she faced the same prospects that Orpah did. But something kept her holding on to Naomi. I think that she had seen God in Naomi's life. And when she really now had this choice to make, to choose between going back to her life in Moab and Moab's gods and that lifestyle, and what she saw in Naomi, that's what really drew her to Naomi. And it doesn't even seem to faze Ruth that Naomi says, "Oh, God is against me." Doesn't it? I might give me pause. Oh, this person, God's not real happy with them right now. Maybe I need to walk about 10 feet away from them as we're going down the road. That doesn't seem to bother her. Then we have Naomi. She's a grieving widow. She's a grieving mother. And I'm sure that she had those thoughts like we all do, like, you know what? This was all my fault. When he wanted to come to this country, I didn't feel good about it. I should have spoke up, but he's the husband, We shouldn't have come. We shouldn't have left our home. We shouldn't have let our children marry outside of the Jewish faith. They married these Moabite women. That was something that God told them, don't intermarry with these pagan nations. They'll bring you grief. It made me think of what Rebecca said when she sent Jacob to go stay with Laban, because Esau was trying to kill him. But I think she had a little bit of another motive too. In Genesis 27:46, it says, "Then Rebekah said to Isaac, 'I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living.'" Now that sounds like a mother-in-law to me. Esau had taken these two wives from the Hittites, and she was miserable with them. When these people got married, when their sons married, they didn't move across town or live in the next state or down the street. They lived with them. In Jewish tradition, the son built onto the father's home and brought his bride there. So they were all together. So that was not a happy situation. I think it was a little bit of the motive why she helped Jacob trick Isaac, because right before that chapter about where he steals the blessing, that's one of the last things she talks about are those Hittite women that Esau had married. But Naomi, fortunately, she didn't feel that way about her daughter-in-laws. There was a lot of love there. But Naomi feels like God is against her because she made some wrong choices. Sometimes we get to a point in our life and we look back and we go, "Oh, well, here I am. I should have taken that left at Albuquerque kind of thing. I made some wrong choices, and look what happened." Have you ever felt like that? It's like, well, I've made my bed. I guess I just have to lie in it. I'm getting what I deserve. And we forget about God's mercies sometimes, don't we? That God's merciful. She's not mad at God. She doesn't seem to blame him. She just has resolved herself to where she's at in life. And she could have had a pity party. She could have had a pity party and just stayed in Moab, couldn't she? And just felt sorry for herself for the rest of her life. But instead, she leaned into her faith, her hope, and she returned. She turned. What do we call that? When we turn, we repent, right? We turn toward God. So she she's going back to Judah. What God won't do for brokenhearted people, right? He will. He'll turn things all around when we put our trust in him. Verses 15 through 18. I can find it. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you will go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So Orpah is going back to her people and her gods, plural, right? So even though she and Ruth had the same experience living in the same house with Naomi and observing her life and seeing how she did it, she had a different response than what Ruth did. Ruth decides to stay with Naomi, and listen to what she says. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. Where you go, I go. Where you die, I die. This is covenant language that she's speaking. This is a promise. You know, she is serious. Let's look at a couple of scriptures. Genesis 17, 7 through 8. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Exodus 6, I almost hate to say it, 6, 7. I think that's dying down, though. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and the mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. Jeremiah 30:22. So you will be my people, and I will be your God. Revelation 21:3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Ruth is using covenant language. Your God, my God. Your people, my people. You know, up to this point, Naomi probably never realized how much attention Ruth had paid to her. You know, Naomi was a Jew in a pagan land. She was a fish out of water. But she must have continued to live her life as a godly woman, as a follower of God, and Ruth saw that. Ruth loved her and saw God in her and wanted that for her life. I remember when I began my faith journey, shortly after I became a mom. Before that, I was out in the world. And I was looking for God. I was visiting churches, trying to figure out what it was all about. And I remember that Ella invited me to Spirit Life Fellowship. And I came a few times. And I remember one morning, and I remember it was during worship. I don't know what the song was, but I just remember the presence I felt. And I remember the expression on the praise team's faces and the people around me. How they were just, like we were last night, just praising God. And you could see the love. You could see the peace that was upon them. What a huge impression that was. I remember it so well. I just remember looking and seeing everyone's faces. And I said to myself, that's it. I want that. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I want. And so that was at the beginning of my relationship with Jesus. And, you know, I consider Ella a little bit of a spiritual mom for me. She was my first teacher. But we, you know, being neighbors, we've also been very, very close I always kind of think of us kind of as like a Naomi and a Ruth, because her people are my people. And my people have become her people. And both at church and at home. And I was with one of her people last night, you know, at the concert. I think of her as my sister. You know, her God became my God. And not even, it says, you know, if even, you know, she said, let the Lord deal with me severely if even death separates us. Well, guess what? When we're brothers and sisters and family in Christ, death is not going to separate us, right? Ruth doesn't even realize what she's saying, what truths she is speaking. You know that's God, right? So Ruth turned from her life in Moab and from Moab's gods and followed not just Naomi, but Naomi's God. She committed her life to both, regardless of what the sacrifice, what it was going to mean. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this is what she needed to do. This God was going to be her God, and that she was going to be with Naomi through this. Verses 19 through 22. Yeah, 19 through 22. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women explained, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So it's been 10 plus years since she's been there. But people, when she comes to town, people are excited to see her. Again, I don't think Naomi realized the light that came from her, that the people loved her. Her daughter-in-laws loved her. People were excited to see her, because I'm assuming they say, "Can this be Naomi?" instead of, "Can this be Naomi?" She's looking a little rough after all these years. I don't think that was how it was said. I think people were excited to see her, because that's what the word says. And so she may have been surprised by that excitement. You know, she hadn't realized the impact she had on Ruth, so she probably hadn't realized the impact she'd had on the people from there. And they said, "Is this Naomi?" And it maybe hadn't registered with everyone yet. Well, where's her husband's? Where's her son's? So she gets her story. She's getting her story out there right away. "Oh, don't get too excited. Let me tell you, it's been rough." We all run into those people like, "Oh, you know, has this been terrible? I have had all," you know, they want to tell you about all the terrible things that have happened. And she's like, "Don't even call me Naomi anymore. Just call me Mara. Just call me bitter." And, you know, a lot of people talk about, oh, Naomi's name change. We hear a lot of name changes in the Bible, right? Who changed Naomi's name? She did. Everybody else, Saul to Paul, who gave him his new name? Jesus. Simon to Peter, who gave him his new name? Jesus. She's trying to rename herself. Do you know in the rest of the book of Ruth, she is referred to Naomi throughout the rest of it. She is never called Mara in the rest of the book. You might try to change your name, but that doesn't mean that that's who you are. You know, sometimes we'll take on that, we'll go through seasons of, you know, feeling down or depressed, and we want to change our name to bitter. We want to be like Droopy, you know, or Eeyore. But you can't keep that up and have a, you know, a good life. But she's wanting to get that story out there right now to let them know, hey, you know, don't get too excited. I'm not coming back. You know, I'm coming back. I'm a widow. I don't have anything. I just got this daughter-in-law. She's a Moabite. You know, I've just been through a lot of stuff. So, you know, don't get too excited. You know, she has had some painful events and losses. And, you know, sometimes when you go through that, it is kind of hard to stay upbeat and positive through all of it. Sometimes we do have to kind of have that little bit of mourning time. But we've got to come out of it. We've got to take our lumps. And then we also have to get back up. You know, that's when we really, during those difficult times, that's when we really have to lean into our faith and just give everything over to God. because he is near the brokenhearted. And he will work all things out for our good. So we're going to end there. Next time we'll pick up. We'll try to get through the rest of Ruth. But there's a lot of good stuff in here. I hope you'll read it. Amen.